and information is from a higher perspective. Your host, news and information, Harry Wilkins, from a higher perspective. Your host, Harry Wilkins. Hello, and welcome to the Spirit and Wellness Show. My name is Harry Wilkinson, and this is the show where we talk about the days and weeks, events, happenings in the world of politics, international news, the environment, technology, everything that we interact with on a daily or weekly basis, whether it be through traditional media or the proliferation of new media that seems to surround us endlessly, 24-hour news networks, even your smartphone, your computer, your tablet, your social media, however it may get to you, or even just on the radio as you're driving in or out of work. We get bombarded by an awful lot of information, much of it not particularly as important as it seems to think it is, number one, and number two, oftentimes deliberately designed to provoke anxiety, stress, as ways of getting attention from the listener or the viewer. You have to remember that media outlets now are not independent outlets. They are struggling for ratings like everything else. It used to not be that way many years ago. News was given a long leash to do what it needed to do as a public service. And I explained, I think in last week's episode, I explained the origin behind that, in that the airwaves are public, they belong to all of us, and when a station gets a license to use one of these airwaves, they enter into an agreement with, or they are supposed to enter into an agreement with the U.S. government, and by extension us, the public, that they provide a certain amount of public programming, public information for free. That means commercial free. But those laws have been, diluted over the years until I think there's remnants of them left, but they're not very powerful or enforced. So what we have now, and then add cable onto it, that doesn't play quite by the same rules. Now you have networks, stations, even newspapers fighting for ratings, attention, and all of that kind of thing. And so they're going to tell stories that will provoke in order to get attention. It's good to keep that in mind. That's number one. Number two is that from the metaphysical aspect that I approach this show with, if you've listened before, you understand what I mean. We are creating it all at the highest level of our being, at our highest metaphysical expression, if you will. Our connection to divine mind is what I often call it. And we are actually creating everything around us. And we're creating it for a reason. We're creating it to have experiences, pure and simple. Because the truth of who and what we are is beyond all of these situations. The truth of who and what we are is that we are divine mind, that we are creators, and we are more powerful than often we understand at the lower level of our being. The small us, you could think of that as sort of an avatar, immersed in a virtual reality game, and there are certain rules And the avatar has certain strengths and certain weaknesses that the big us, the true us, doesn't have. But in the interest of playing the game and having the experiences, we add these little quirks. And so through the course of these experiences, we may feel anxiety, we may feel fear, we may feel loss and pain. All of these things which are not the truth of our nature, but they are experiences that we go through. And by going through, ultimately, it reconnects us with that truth of who we are. It helps us to expand and remember that truth. That everything around us is illusion, that there is no loss, there is no death, there is not even real pain, although it can feel very real in the illusory games that we create. And so approaching these stories with that in mind, going into these stories, and for a certain amount of time, you almost have to let those buttons be pushed that kind of bring up all of these anxious or worry thoughts or anger thoughts or what have you. You have to let that rise up and bubble up. And then, through meditation, through mindfulness, allow that to bubble up and fade away and take a look at it from a different perspective, from the perspective I just explained, that this is something you, at the highest level of your being, has created for a reason, to help you expand, remember who you really are, and take that energy from that which you've created. And also honor what you've created. Honor it. Honor the amazing reality that it appears to have. Because it feels so real. You created that. Honor that. But also understand the truth of what it really is. And that allows you to take energy from it, and that allows you to expand, and it also empowers you not to feel at the mercy of whatever appears to be happening around you, but to actually be empowered to deal with it effectively. So that is my point of view on this show. Today we're going to be talking about falling back, because many of you may be waking up to and remembering that this is a time of the year in many parts of this country where we turn the clocks back for daylight savings time. But I want to talk about that falling back, but also falling back in a larger sense as well. And we're going to talk about the amazing power of mushrooms, and one man, part of our Heroes of Consciousness segment, that I call the Mushroom Man, who has advocated for, explored, discovered the power of mushrooms and how they can help and heal humankind. And then we'll wrap up with a voting meditation, as this is, we're getting into voting season now. And many people, basically people are falling into a couple of categories. Those who are adamant about what they're going to vote for and know exactly what they're going to vote for. Those who might not be so sure of what they're going to vote for, and those who might not even be sure they're going to vote at all. So we're going to talk about that in a voting meditation. and about the empowerment that the the state of mind of voting gives you, whether or not what you vote for is going to win or not, actually may not even be that important. It's more the state of mind that you're in. So let's talk about falling back, because you probably are familiar with the old phrase that helps us remember what to do with our clocks. Spring ahead, fall back. Well, we passed the fall equinox, so now this is the time when many of us are turning the clocks back. I have to admit that I'm not a big fan of daylight savings time at all. I don't understand the need for it. Most of the world doesn't even observe it. So if you're dealing with other countries in Asia or Africa, you're adding more confusion to an already complex situation of time differences and calculating that as well. So I'm not a big fan of it. I don't see the necessity for it. I understand that years ago, for the purposes of farming, it was done to allow farmers to have an extra hour of daylight to do what they need to do, but it just seems odd since it happens in autumn, when the only thing that's really happening in a farming sense is harvesting, which you don't really need a lot of sunlight for. And you're not planting. You don't start planting until spring. So this is just a period of time when harvesting happens, and so maybe the extra hours of daylight is for them to be able to harvest without being in the dark. I don't know, but it's interesting. And looking at the perspective that we look at things from on this show, what it has to say about time, and what time really means, what time truly is. So I'll get to that in a minute, but I also wanted to talk about falling back in a larger sense, in that for many people, this is a time of falling back. Just in what is happening in the world right now, there's a sense of falling back to old patterns of behavior, fearful patterns of behavior. And we see that happening all around, not just in this country, but in other countries as well. Brazil, Europe, where there's a rising tide of fear, in which many people are falling back on old ways of doing things, fear mongering. And they're falling back because perhaps the changes, the moving forward that we've also been experiencing in the world feels too much for them. When I talked about the transition era that we are in, which I did on this show as a series for over a year, I believe, back in, I believe it was 2014 and 2015. I talked about